and Dr. Sullivan for having me here to work with you and share some ideas. I'll give you a little bit of background and context where I'm coming from. I'm a former high school history teacher. I actually taught at Plymouth South High School for about 10 years in the history department there. And then approximately 8 or 9 years ago was given the opportunity to join Ed Tech Teacher. So what I've been able to do for that duration of time is help schools and districts all over the country kind of like carefully and thoughtfully integrate technology. I've had the opportunity to come to Cohasset a few times over that, those 8 years. I was actually really kind of fortunate now that I think back on it. I was able to teach online. Geez, this might be like 12 or 13 years ago when I was teaching in Plymouth and teaching online. It was a very different context. And I pull from a lot of that experience, pull from the experience of running online classes for the past 8 years myself. And one thing to be really clear on is like, while I can help the teachers in Cohasset with like high quality online design and best practices with regards to online learning, but it's an idea that I'll share now and one we'll come back to later, is like the context in which they're doing all of this is unprecedented. High quality online teaching and learning. There's research behind it, and there's plenty of kind of experience in that field that we can kind of look to and lean on and develop based on those characteristics. But all of the research and the practice hasn't happened during a pandemic, when like the whole landscape of what's happening now with regards to kind of like global changes and what's going on socially, and the shift in like what do schools look like and what's the purpose of them, and the anxiety and maybe like the stress levels that are emerging because of a number of different kind of environmental and social and political factors. Like, so everything that's going on globally and how it does tie into what's happening in terms of the schools, because it has an impact on people's capacity to kind of navigate this totally new world for teachers of teaching and learning online, and a new experience for your students of kind of like the learning experience for the learner end of this online. So what I want to share with you tonight is kind of a vision for what does it really mean? What are some of the core principles and ideas and benchmarks for high quality online teaching and learning? What's some of the perspective that I've shared with the teachers in Cohasset that the leadership team has established in terms of what are we thinking about in terms of high quality online teaching and learning? And like we mentioned as well, please feel free to along the way, if you have a question, drop it in the Q&A section, and I'll do my best to kind of address them or keep an eye on those as we work through the ideas this evening. So one of the kind of central ideas that I presented to the staff when I was working with Cohasset teachers is kind of calibrating their perspective around how are they envisioning what their role is, what the experience of the student is, and then how does that inform my decision-making around what is the online learning, what is the face-to-face learning. So I think if we consider that top line there, if it's the case that the educators are entering this scenario this year and going, my students are face-to-face learners who also happen to learn online, then the kind of what the impact is what is the impact on face-to-face of my online kind of experience, and then what is the purpose of online? So in that case, the online learning in some ways becomes like lower level kind of, it's almost like low hanging fruit. We create experiences that in some ways don't become like the primary focal point of the experience. But when I was working with the teachers, I was sharing this perspective of what if we were to shift our thinking a bit? And what if we were to say, okay, my students are primarily online learners. That's the environment that I'm really thinking and planning and designing for, is high quality online instruction. Then when I'm able to see them, whether it's face-to-face or in a live synchronous call, how can I supplement the high quality online experience with that kind of precious face-to-face time that I have with them? Then my thinking shifts to, what is the impact of face-to-face on my online experience, and what is the purpose of the face-to-face experience? I mean, increasingly, here's the reality. Every district that I'm working with around the country, even today, local districts in Massachusetts, where the landscape is shifting quickly, what things were looking like a week ago don't look that way now. And we're even having to lean on contingency plans and start-stop protocols and all of this quickly shifting, uncertain landscape. And one of the messages I've been sharing is, if we design as if all of our learners are online learners, it's way more reasonable to take an online unit that you've mapped out and built carefully and use that digital content in a face-to-face environment. It is exceptionally challenging to go the other way and go, well, I was planning for face-to-face, but now I have to quickly pivot or make that content work online. It's really hard to do that. And so the message I've been sharing is, build out your unit, build out your week, kind of map out the experience, not on a day-to-day lens, but on a multi-day, a week long, a unit long, a concept long lens, as if every student is an online learner. We can keep the online learners reasonably moving forward with a well-designed online experience. And then I start to rethink the purpose of my face-to-face time. I think about when I taught in Plymouth, my face-to-face time was used for sometimes instruction, sometimes group work, sometimes discussion that was taking place. But now in this environment, it's likely better practice to go, okay, if I can take the content, the curriculum, the skill, the ability, and if I can package that effectively into a well-designed, meaningful, high-quality online experience, now my face-to-face time becomes interaction, creating connections, practicing, giving a space for student voice, and maybe the live time that we have with them is not necessarily going to be dedicated to the instruction of new content. That can effectively be built online. And I think that's maybe a critical shift in the thinking that I tried to share with the Cohasset teachers as we were working through starting to navigate, what does it look like if we're going to shift this world into an online space? Now we have to pair that with some really kind of present challenges. So you can see here, this was a little back and forth between myself and Eric Hudson, who's the director of the Global Online Academy, who's been doing this work with online instruction for years. And I posed this question out to my my digital kind of cohort and community online of like, hey, my experience has been when I build these things myself, when I build digital experiences for my learners, my adult learners, it takes me about 3 times, sometimes 4 or 5 times as long to plan for a digital experience as compared to if I could walk into a school and run a workshop or sit down with my students in a face-to-face interaction. And I'm happy that Eric replied so thoughtfully. He's like, yeah, that's been my experience as well. That's why we're starting to think of, instead of individual lessons, we might have to think much longer in terms of the week, the project, the driving question, or the unit. And now how can we start to determine what can I do with that kind of self-paced independent time digitally? What can I do with either the live time in a physical environment or the live time on a Zoom or a Google Meet call that can support, right? That can support the digital experience that I've already mapped out. It doesn't mean it's easy, but normally the preparation would be like a day-to-day preparation. If things were back to normal and this was December of last year and we're walking into the building every day, I can prepare every day for that face-to-face interaction relatively quickly. Like I can navigate that experience. But now we're asking teachers to shift really quickly. And I think we should also be really clear. I think I made it a little bit clear earlier in the first session with the elementary parents is that what happened in the spring was not necessarily online learning. A lot of that was like emergency management and like figuring out something that could happen in a reasonably short time frame. And I think what we're becoming more aware of now is that high quality online learning doesn't necessarily equate to live Zoom calls on a bell schedule at 45, 50, or 60 minutes at a clip, because it's such a burden and an impact not only on the educator, but on the student. And we'll get more to that in a minute. But I think we have to recognize like the challenge of preparing for this online space is pretty immense. To create high quality online experiences, it's really challenging. It takes time, it takes practice and skill and ability and increased comfort level and awareness of how they should be designed. It's listening to feedback of parents and students on like, can we navigate this independently? Are we creating opportunities for students to have voice and share their thinking? And can teachers get a sense of what students know and what they don't know? And how do they start to balance, what do I do with that precious face-to-face time? And how can I really leverage that? And now what can I put into that self-paced time that's a better use of that time than simply going live with every call and doing live teaching for 6 hours a day on a Zoom call? It's likely not best practice for anyone. So shifting now a bit, like when we're saying high quality online instruction, what do we really mean by that? So there tends to be about 5 kind of tent poles or markers for high quality online instruction. Some of them, like knowing your infrastructure, that doesn't really apply to this group tonight. Like you don't have to know the infrastructure of G Suite and Google Classroom. It's helpful to understand it from the parent perspective, but that's on the educator to do that. What I want to target here is something that does impact you and your learners at home is, can we design online learning experiences that students can navigate on their own? So what I mean by that is, can we carefully think of, okay, on a Monday, when my students enter into this new content, and my context for this is I was a history teacher, right? So when we're starting out with that new content on Monday, give me 1 second. Nothing like environmental factors like car alarms going off in your neighborhood. We're back. If I'm starting out with that unit, can I design this experience where my students can enter this on Monday? I can make it so clear and transparent in terms of what they need to do on Monday, where the workspace is on Tuesday. They feel confident navigating that. The burden isn't necessarily on the parent or the caregiver at home. The student feels like they know where to go. And I'll talk about even like minimizing clicks or removing barriers to the experience. And this is some of the work that I did with the Cohasset teachers, is even modeling for them, what does it look like when you experience a high quality online environment? That's not simply one modality. Like I think many years ago when I taught through virtual high school, and I could post to a text on a web page, have kids answer questions in a text discussion forum and turn in Word documents. Now, the experience I built for the Cohasset teachers, I was embedded in the experience with video. I created environments for them to kind of practice and engage. I had audio of me in the experience with them. So we can create a richer experience that's easier to navigate for the learner, as opposed to complicated learning management systems that no one can really make sense of. So the technology is there. We just need to develop the skill and ability and the capacity over time, right? And seeing what colleagues down the hall are doing. Like the biggest impact of teacher practice, to be totally transparent, it's not me coming to Cohasset and helping. It's the teacher next door who experiments and shares their practice down the hall. Or it's someone in the department who experiments with a new idea, they see a positive impact, and they share that practice with someone else after we're able to engage in that professional learning experience. So I just want to address a comment here. It all makes sense, focusing on online lesson preparation and not doing a bell schedule. But what we're observing is the latter in our children's classes. I'll schedule a face. So you know what? I want to keep an eye on that one. And maybe at some point, either Dr. Sullivan or Dr. Scollins, we can address the comment in the Q&A. I want to keep moving for a bit, but I think we'll have time to come back to that and kind of consider that idea. We'll do. So what we're trying to do here is like, can we create a space where kids can comfortably, reasonably, and meaningfully engage with online experiences? Now, the bell schedule idea, it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad practice, right? I think one thing we have to be aware of, and I'll get to in a moment, is being really careful and thoughtful with the time that we have, whether that's live or self-paced, synchronous or asynchronous. But this is another idea that I shared with everyone was, you know, can we make it so there's a unified location over multiple days? And it doesn't mean we're getting there immediately. It means we're going to work our way there. Can we even minimize the technical barriers? Like, can we minimize the number of clicks? Right? Can we provide interaction in multiple modalities? So I think about even in a face-to-face environment, I'm sure Dr. Scollins and Dr. Sullivan, you've experienced this. I have the directions on paper. I read the directions to the students, or I have the students read the directions. I'm like, okay, we're ready to go. And hands shoot up with, what are we supposed to do right now? And that's after they've read the directions. And I think we've mapped them out pretty clearly. It's exacerbated in an online environment if we only give students one modality to engage with the content. So in everything that I build, and in a lot of the advice I'm providing, and the guidance and the development and the professional work, is that, yeah, we might be able to provide the prompt or the question or the writing assignment or the content in text, but we often have to supplement that with audio or video. I need to provide context for the challenge or the task I'm presenting for the students. I need to like introduce them, build a little confidence, welcome them to the idea that they're about to explore, not simply throw them into it. and I keep referencing this group I was just with in Chicago before I got on with all of you. And we were talking about having high school students read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It's like a 7-page PDF by Dr. King. I can't simply take that PDF, link it in Google Classroom, and keep my fingers crossed and hope that we can all analyze it effectively. But what can I do? I can break it into smaller chunks digitally. I can put myself right next to the reading in a pre-recorded video that the students can watch me for 30 seconds, 60 seconds and go, okay, I understand what I'm about to read now. I'm ready to engage with that content. And then we embed a checkpoint question, a reflection, a little check-in activity right next to that reading. So we can design these things really effectively. Like I mentioned as well, we can embed these checks for understanding. And I think this one here, removing barriers, I'll talk about that a bit in terms of assessment. Can we remove barriers for kids to share their thinking? Can we remove technical barriers so kids can feel confident shifting from Google Classroom to the workspace and back to Google Classroom? And it requires some like thoughtful planning and practice, but we're getting there because everyone is in a completely new normal with a magnification of the amount of time it takes to prepare this content. We're talking 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the amount of time needed to prepare really high quality online instruction. So I want to continue, and actually at any point, either Dr. Scollins or Dr. Sullivan, if you'd like to jump in, let me know, unmute your microphone. If you want to share an idea, we can absolutely do that. This graph, I think, is immensely helpful when starting to paint a picture for what could and what should online learning look like. Here's what I saw happen in the spring. If we look at this on the vertical measure, high bandwidth, low bandwidth, horizontal measure, high immediacy, low immediacy. When we think about high bandwidth, we're typically talking about the Wi-Fi or the internet connection at home and the device being able to hold up to streaming video, working online, accessing the internet. But I think if we think about high bandwidth differently, like human bandwidth, and this is the burden that I see. Schools in the spring were relying exclusively on that red quadrant. High bandwidth, high immediacy. It was video calls for 6 hours at a clip with like no integration of lower immediacy experiences. So we go over to that yellow quadrant. It's still high bandwidth in terms of the technology burden. Like we have to have a solid internet connection to engage with pre-recorded video, pre-recorded audio, self-paced audio discussion forums. I was with a group this morning where we're working on posing the audio question of the week on Monday, and students have until Wednesday to reply to it, and they can listen to their peers at a self-paced experience. So when a student is ready and capable, they can engage with that. And by the end of the week, everyone is engaged with that audio environment. And now the purpose of the live call is to really reflect, discuss, and come prepared to have a meaningful discussion, because that's something that we can only do live, right? And if we look at this the mapping of like, where do our online classes tend to fall? It doesn't mean it shouldn't fall in the red quadrant. We should take advantage of this technology, but what are we doing with the live time that is a super valuable experience? We should take advantage of the yellow quadrant when it's suitable. We should take advantage of the blue and green quadrant, lower bandwidth, like asynchronous collaborative documents. Those are immediate, but they're lower bandwidth. Or low immediacy, low bandwidth, right? That's like simply leveraging email or having discussion forums. But I think what happens is classes tend to gravitate towards one quadrant, and that can put a huge burden on the learner and on the educator in that environment. We need to think a little more expansively about all of the different quadrants where an online class can fall. That brings us to another interesting kind of almost like binary discussion that's happening around synchronous and asynchronous. Now, I think if I asked everyone in, let's see, I remember I was in New Jersey, like March 2nd, I did my last workshop. I was driving home. I was supposed to stop in Connecticut to do a workshop. I was going to stop in New York to do a workshop. And it was, everything is shutting down, go home. And then within a week of that, the language of asynchronous and synchronous started to emerge in everyone's vocabulary immediately. And while I think they're helpful, I want to almost present a lens later that could maybe like complement this whole idea of asynchronous or synchronous. But the point of this kind of graphic in this table is maybe to help illuminate the idea that there are certain sorts of kind of educational experiences in an online environment that lend themselves to asynchronous or self-paced. When students are absorbing new content, when they're engaged in kind of deeper learning or really trying to navigate complex ideas at like a slow, methodical pace, when students are reflecting on their own learning or they're engaging in formative assessment practices, that is better suited for that self-paced experience. So for example, a student in a physics class that's exploring a new concept around like force and motion, like the teacher can explain that in a live call, but that might not be the best use of the time. Whereas the teacher could create a pre-recorded video, embed it into a well-designed digital experience that gives students the content, room to practice, room to reflect, and room to check in. And that can all happen self-paced over the course of a day or two. Then what do we do with the live time? We have students do things like in the live call, small group discussion, maybe in breakout rooms, or maybe in small group discussion face-to-face. Maybe we do conferencing or check-ins with students in smaller environments. We provide feedback on the work that they have engaged with. We allow students to share evidence of their thinking, or maybe even more importantly, we allow kids to make connections to one another and give them a space to share their voice. Dr. Sullivan.
Yes, thank you, Greg. I think this is a good slide to address the question that was asked, because the question really talks about how right now at the middle and the high school, which is where our parents are right now in this session, we are looking at trying to keep the learning moving. And as you've described, creating one big remote lesson, but really trying to prioritize that in-person time and that time when they're remote. But we are having at least some deep, meaningful check-ins during a class. And what you have highlighted right now is part of what I do see those check-ins being and what will be happening during those. Really leveraging the important synchronous time to check in, to give feedback, maybe to clarify a few things before having the remote learners go off and do some of the high leveraged work asynchronously and have those in-person learners learn in person, but we're keeping it moving together. And that is what I've been talking about. And I think you very eloquently stated it. I've been struggling to state this in several meetings. So thank you for that. And to the person who asked it, I hope that clarifies what you would hope to see, what we hope to see as we go forward. And Dr. Scollins, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, and I just a little piece around the fact that it's going to take us time to get there. Our teachers, you know, Greg has spoken and said it a couple of times that, you know, we were thrown this and teachers weren't taught this in school. This isn't how they were taught how to teach. So they have to really think differently and have a different mindset about what does it look like and how do they create those lessons. So over time, you'll see some changes as teachers develop more, just like children develop more. You'll see the teachers' practices change also, because our intention is to continue this and to continue some, you know, more professional development for our teachers so they can continue to grow in this. So I do think you'll see some differences as time goes on.
Yeah, it's a huge shift, like, and it takes a tremendous amount of time. And like, there's a comment about like, hey, what's specifically being done in terms of support in the district? Like, I know I was able to connect with teachers in the district and build a self-paced experience for them to start to kind of explore many of these ideas around what does high quality online learning look like. But to Dr. Scollins' point, like, there's no teacher prep program that prepares you for what's going on right now. And it's like, there's so many moving parts. It's okay, the schedule has shifted. I need to become ridiculously proficient with the tools to build effectively. I need to understand almost like, you know, what is high quality design look like? How can I build something that students can navigate independently and with like high quality, and like, and then we need to consider assessment and we need to consider feedback. There's so many moving parts with this. And I think the challenging part to this is it's going to take time, but the airplane is already flying. Like, I'm sure you've heard this expression before. Like, the reality is everyone is building this as we're going. Like, the amount of time it takes to build a high quality online course is exponential compared to the amount of time it takes to prepare for a face-to-face interaction. But the teachers that we've worked with in the district, they've been exposed to, they've been kind of introduced to, and they started to navigate not only these like kind of theoretical ideas about high quality online teaching and learning, but really practical stuff in terms of how do I build it within the core set of tools that we have available to us. To highlight this point again, and to support Dr. Sullivan's point, it's that we're almost rethinking what is the use of the face-to-face time. And in many instances, the face-to-face time is now really leveraged in terms of like, what is the interaction between the teacher and the learner? What is the interaction between the learners, as opposed to what content am I presenting to them? Because if I can package it reasonably and carefully and thoughtfully and package it in a well-designed kind of self-paced experience, I should, because now the reality is it frees me up to do the best part of the job, which is clarifying, having kids share their thinking, provide feedback, get kids interacting with ideas, and I don't have to use that precious time to teach new content. This is also not to say that face-to-face time will never involve teaching content ever again. That will not be the case, right? We have to use it, and it's up to the teacher to kind of determine when should I be doing that kind of instruction, and this is the stuff that they're attempting to navigate right now, which is really challenging to navigate. So I want to jump ahead a bit, and this is actually an idea that we didn't necessarily present in the first session, but I think it applies more to this group. There's a piece going back to 2014 by Grant Wiggins around the validity of assessment. And I wanted to bring it up with this group tonight because I think it's a really critical one, because assessment is so challenging right now. Creating high quality digital or high quality online assessments is challenging and problematic because students have access to an abundance of information. We can't control their home environment the way we can kind of control the physical environment of a classroom. We can control what access to information they have, what materials and resources they have, put them in an online environment, an environment that we don't have any control over. Create an assessment looks different. So I think there's this really two-part question we can ask here around assessment with regards to online learning is, could students kind of navigate the task effectively, but not really demonstrate proficiency with like the underlying purpose? So oftentimes, and this is challenging to get to the point where we can design high quality digital assessments, is can we really target not the task, but the goal and the purpose of the assessment? And I know this happens face-to-face, and it's also really challenging to navigate it digitally. We might create a task for students, but because of the abundance of information they have access to, but because of the resources they have and the connectivity to information, they can successfully navigate the task, but they really don't develop the proficiency around the skills and abilities that we're really targeting with the task. Or the other thing happens, which is even also problematic, and we can see this kind of second highlight here. Could students do a poor job on the task, but still there's plenty of evidence to support the fact that they can meet the purpose of the assessment? And this is where I like to think about online learning in terms of the opportunity. So think about it this way. Here's my target. Here's my assessment. This is the skill and the ability that I'm measuring. The only entry point that I put for students to get there is linear text on a digital document. The only way I'm letting them show their understanding is by typing words on a digital page. I've created a barrier for students to demonstrate their understanding. And if I'm not assessing typing and writing as a purpose of the assessment, it's almost as if the assessment becomes invalid, because a student could reasonably navigate the task but not really be able to address the true fundamental purpose of the assessment. Or in the second highlighted case here, if I put digital text as the barrier and students are kind of hitting that barrier and going like, this is a huge obstacle for me at the middle school or even the high school level, and we're not giving kids the opportunity to show their understanding with all of the available resources, like students creating video, students creating audio, students engaging in a live debate in a live call. Like, if I want kids to clearly articulate a point and convince me of a unique historical perspective, and the only entry point I give them is text, that might be kind of an invalid assessment, because they can get to that end goal, but the digital experience I put in the way is creating the barrier. And so I like to think about online learning as a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of things like student-created audio, student-created video, slower paced, right, self-paced audio discussion environments, slower paced video environments where kids can capture and share their thinking over time in things like audio portfolios and video portfolios, which can be executed with the tools that are already in place that teachers have been exposed to and are already using. It's just going to take us time to get to the place where we can build those effectively. So now I want to talk a bit about video and the role that video can play. And there's a huge kind of raging debate online amongst the educators about cameras on and cameras off. Like, that's not necessarily the debate that I want to get into tonight. I don't think that's the focal point of what we're doing here. But I think what's really interesting is what the impact is on students, on young students, when they're engaged in this environment for an extended duration of time, right? Meaningful, well-designed video check-ins are ideal. Extensive all day long on a Zoom call can be really problematic. And there's two ways to look at this. It might be more convenient, and I have my own young learners here as well. If my 6 and 8-year-old could sit in front of a Zoom call for 4 hours a day, and myself and my wife didn't have to like guide them through the experience when they're working self-paced and like navigate the challenges of what's going on with online learners, and they could do that, that would be great. But I think a question that educators need to ask themselves and teachers should consider is when they're going to use video, live video or self-paced video, is that really the best context for learning for our students? So just because we can get them in a live call, should we get them in a live call? Just because we can get them in a live call doesn't mean that that's where the kind of direct instruction should take place, when that live call is likely best suited for interaction, connection, feedback, discussion, practice, examples of learning, having students share their experience and their expertise. So that's one way to kind of think about and consider what should we do with that video time. But here's another one that I think is even more interesting and maybe in some ways a little bit more problematic to consider, is that there's research out of the MIT Teaching Systems Lab that points to the fact that having kids on video can exacerbate normal stressors of adolescence, like normal anxiety that kids might feel by being in a face-to-face environment. It's been correlated with the idea of if we put students on a live call like this environment for an extended amount of time, the cognitive impact is one that they feel like they're being asked to stand in front of their peers for an entire class period. Like, I think to my experience in the classroom teaching in Plymouth for about 10 years of, I would never once ask a student to stand in front of the class for 52 minutes, right? The impact on their kind of emotional well-being, the impact on their confidence in the class, their willingness to engage, their willingness to share. And we have these ridiculously powerful live video environments, right? But I think we need to think really carefully about the duration of the time, how we're using the time, and how we're creating ability for students to connect with one another in those live video environments, and not increasing anxiety about their learning or increasing anxiety that they're normally feeling at this kind of stage of development that they're going through already if Zoom and Google Meet wasn't even on the table. So there's a time for it. I'm not at all proposing that live calls are off the table. But I think we need to consider, and this is the ideas that I shared with the teachers and we've talked about with the leadership in Cohasset, is that there's a time for live video, and then there's a time for really well-designed self-paced experiences where students can have time to carefully and thoughtfully reflect. I even like to think of this in terms of an experiment I used to do when I would run live workshops, where I would pass out a piece of origami paper to everyone in the workshop and project a video on the front of the board of someone's hands, kind of a bird's eye view of someone folding to make a paper crane. I would click play on the video and ask everyone to keep up. And in a room of 30 people, maybe 3 or 4 could complete the task, and there's increasing levels of frustration in the room. I would give everyone another piece of origami paper, give them the link to the video, have them throw in their headphones, and go through the process self-paced in a reasonable duration of time, and the completion rate skyrocketed, the confidence skyrocketed. So again, I look at this as an opportunity. If we go to that yellow quadrant, the quadrant I was talking about earlier, let me get myself out of the way, that yellow quadrant, it's still high bandwidth, right? We need a solid internet connection, but it's low immediacy. The student can play and replay. They can rewind and watch it back again. They can, like, if they're missed that point, they can stop, get their thoughts together, reflect on the idea, and then keep watching that self-paced video. It doesn't mean that's the foundation of the course. Again, the red, yellow, blue, and green, an online experience can be spread amongst all of those quadrants, and it can't simply fall in the red or simply fall in the yellow. It won't meet the needs of all learners, but it's an important idea to keep in mind of, like, what is the best use of the time? So I see a few ideas that have popped up in the chat. Kind of like keeping an idea, great point, live camera. I'm kind of reading through these really quickly. Yeah, I mean, a lot of interesting questions about the live camera usage. It's interesting to consider, like, having the camera on and off. There's ways to measure engagement that don't require the camera, right? We can have reasonable check-ins that don't require the camera. I mean, it's a really like challenging, delicate subject to broach, but I think this issue here, it's not really an on or off issue. Part of it is creating an environment where students are compelled to turn it on. Like, there's something so meaningful, engaging that I want to turn it on. There's an interesting piece that came out of the Harvard Graduate School of Education where a professor was sharing whether his course has the laundry folding test or not. And if his class can't meet the laundry folding test, if his students can sit back, turn the camera off, and fold their laundry during the live call, and there's no compelling reason to turn the camera on, what's the purpose of that live time? If it doesn't pass the laundry folding test, meaning if kids, they need to have that camera on, they want to engage, the students are kind of actively engaged in the experience, and it's not a dissemination of information, then they're compelled to engage in the class. And I can't simply fold my laundry. I'm not saying we're going to apply the laundry folding test to what's going on in Cohasset, but it's an interesting lens to consider. Can we create that live call that's so compelling and so meaningful that students want to be engaged with that experience? Now, here's another lens. And I talked about earlier of, I didn't want this to be just synchronous versus asynchronous. I want to think about it a little more nuanced than that. And here's the lens that I'd like to bring up and maybe tie it back to what we talked about earlier. If we think exclusively of what should happen live versus what should happen self-paced, I think we're missing an opportunity to think a little more carefully about what's going on. Here's what I mean by that. And it's a little bit jargony, and I don't want to get bogged down with the jargon, but the term is being referred to as elastic proximity. What it means is the educator needs to look at the content, the skills, the abilities they want the kids to demonstrate, the curriculum, the complexity of the ideas, and determine what is the ideal proximity between me and the student, the educator and the idea, and the student to the student. So there are many ideas that I explored. I think back to when I was a history teacher and we would read like Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Could I ask my students to read that independently? I could, but the complexity of that reading and the nuance that's going on there, they might be able to read it independently, but I would evaluate, I need to be relatively close to that idea to help my kids navigate it. Then I tie that kind of proximity thinking to, should that now be a synchronous video or synchronous in class experience, or can I make that a self-paced digital experience? And I think if we tie this proximity way of thinking into self-paced, into synchronous, asynchronous, then the teachers can have like this richer lens to really think about designing their class. On the other hand, because of the capacity of the technology that we have today, it's also reasonable to say, I can reasonably take that reading, build it in a digital environment like Google Slides, for example, add myself in short video components throughout that reading. So when students are navigating it, I'm right there with them to help them work through that experience, because I need to be close to it, but my closeness can be digital and it doesn't have to actually be face-to-face. Then we can use the face-to-face time for discussion, problem solving, having students share their perspective and making connections to the ideas in powerful ways. So there's one last idea that I want to get to, and this is in some way to try to pull all of these thoughts and pull these perspectives together. There is plenty of research about high quality online learning, right? However, we're in a different space right now. And while the research points to teachers need to know their infrastructure, we need to create spaces where students can be heard. We need to create opportunities to leverage synchronous and leverage self-paced or asynchronous. all of that is the research that took place primarily in non-K to 12 spaces. So like online learning has been going on in higher ed for quite some time, and a lot of the evidence points to best practice in that environment, not necessarily K to 12 where it's trying to be leveraged now. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We can work from best practice, we can work from research, but in many ways the teachers need to take these ideas, kind of distill them and think about their learners, the technology that's in place, like what the values are of the school and the community and what they're trying to accomplish with their learners, and blend best practice with their students, because they know their students better than I ever will or better than the research will. There's another critical idea here, that all of the research and best practice around online learning didn't happen now during a pandemic, during a really kind of problematic, in some ways traumatic time. Right? I've worked in districts where they're quickly realizing that asking kids to turn cameras on is creating a bigger disconnect and divide in their community because of the physical space that students are allowed to work in when they're at home. Like if we're fortunate enough to have a quiet space, like there's many students that don't have that space. So all of the best practice around online learning hasn't happened now when there's global changes taking place, when there's a pandemic that students and parents and communities are navigating, when there's stress and anxiety around social distancing. Like all of these things have an impact on what's going on in this learning environment. So whatever best practice says, the teachers are going to learn from their students. They're going to learn from kind of like listening to their experience, evaluating how their design of their online learning is playing out. And the best that we can do is work from high quality precedent, but constantly evaluate what's happening and then be open to growing and changing and adapting that practice over time. So ideally, what's going on September 29th, it will look different than what's going on November 1st. And we're going to be able to refine our practice over time. So that was a lot of information, a lot of references to be made. I really hope that the ideas were valuable, the thinking, maybe give you some insight into like what the district is thinking, what the teachers are kind of aware of and grappling with over time. And I'd love to hear maybe more comments from Dr. Scollins or Dr. Sullivan, and kind of leading us towards the end of the session this evening.
Thank you so much, Greg. And yes, that was a lot, but thank you so much, because that was a good overview of what's going on. And I do think that your point is well taken, that what we saw in the spring is very different than what we're seeing now, and we are going to look different as we move forward. The end of October, we're going to look at what's happening across the district based on the reentry plan, but part of that is what does it look like in our classrooms? What's our hybrid model? What's our remote learning? And and how are teachers doing with it? So I do think, as teachers learn more, they'll become more comfortable, and you'll see people trying things and trying to engage their students in a different manner through what they're learning through this remote trainings that they've had.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Dr. Sullivan, if you have anything. I'm looking, there's a couple of questions here. Sorry, just looking real quick.
Yeah, no, I think some of the questions are really talking about the way we can, and I appreciate them because they're right on it. Someone's talking about leveraging our face-to-face time a little more, possibly spending a little more time on that, and using some of the modalities that are out there that are provided by various companies and other things to kind of whether it's Discovery Ed or whatever it might be, kind of leading us into lessons. And yeah, absolutely. But I think one of the major things, I know you advocate this, Dr. Scollins, and certainly Greg does, is to look at this as one big lesson, whether it be a unit or a week out, and to really have our teachers plan in that way so that they are prioritizing those in-person moments, but yet it has a flow to it so that we're not herky-jerky looking at like the A cohort and then the B cohort, and we're not moving the lesson along. So we're certainly doing that, and we're getting better at it. And I think that's to be expected as we go. So I would just advocate for the parents to keep what they're doing now, which is open collaboration, understanding that we're all in this together. We want nothing more than to provide a rigorous learning environment that is sensitive to the times. And this is new for us, but I'm very proud of the way we're progressing. So hopefully we're seeing that as we get into the fall here a little more deeply. And that's all really I want to say on that for now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. So I'm looking to see any other kinds of questions before we have just 2 more minutes. So,
and it's like some of the ideas that emerged around like the math content, you know, Laura posed a question around using existing content. It's interesting. There's academic research around the fact that like, it's really valuable to have the teacher in Cohasset in the video as opposed to the Bozeman science video, for example. But we have to pair that with like the capacity and the time and the ability to make these sorts of things. But leveraging existing video can be reasonable as long as the video is at a reasonable duration. And, you know, I had one of the slides in here about, you know, videos in that 6 to 9 minute mark are ideal. And if we move beyond that, the viewership tanks to about 40% of the total video, and that can be problematic. And, you know, another question about juggling attention between, you know, the in-person students and the virtual students. And that's part of the design that I was sharing with the Cohasset teachers when I work with them. And Dr. Sullivan was just talking about of thinking bigger as opposed to what we're doing face-to-face and what we're doing online or at home, and thinking about the unit or the week that's built out. And if you're at home, I can get you started, we can get up and running, but you understand this really clearly designed digital workspace that'll last over multiple days, whether you're in home or you're with me. But when we're in class, now we're thinking about what are the things that we can only accomplish in class that we can't reasonably do in a digital environment. But teachers in reality, they'll have to unlearn many years of practice. And like, that's really challenging to do, but high quality teaching and learning, it's really similar online and face-to-face. The challenge is, how do we navigate a new schedule? How do we navigate a shift in the time that we have? And how do we figure out what should we put online and what should we keep face-to-face? And that's what we're trying to help them develop a picture of what is the best domain for different types of experiences and content and interaction and discussion or direct instruction.
mm-hmm. And I think there's a learning curve, just like you were saying, Greg. And I think, you know, you are going to see teachers come in and out of more traditional model because that's what they know. So we always go back to what we know when we're not quite sure. So, but the teachers are continuing to grow, and I've gone into classrooms and I'm seeing teachers really working hard to use the skills that they've learned with Greg around how do they build out their lessons, and how do they build it so that it's engaging and it's online and it can be self-paced so that they can kind of figure that out. So I think over time you'll see a change in that. And, you know, we are in discussions all the time. Our principals are talking to our teachers, our department heads are all talking together because we're trying to navigate this together. We're all learning it together as to what it should look like. So really great feedback, and it's nice to see the questions in here.
And to Rick's question as well, a really kind of thoughtful question around like, do we think the kids are getting a similar experience to maybe a traditional experience if this wasn't happening? Like if this condition wasn't drastically upended, like I believe that if it's done effectively, I believe it can be a better experience because the component of a class, the experiences in a classroom that are so much they're so better suited for self-paced, independent exploration. And then you really take advantage of the face-to-face time. And I think if it's done that way, and if it's done really carefully, then I think the students can have a way better experience. But we have to be realistic about this. It's a totally different landscape, right? No one is taught in this environment before. Everyone is being asked to do something they've never done before. And it's reasonably going to take time for teachers to kind of evolve their practice to really take advantage of both environments to the best of their ability.
Right. It's so true. And we're going to continue to work with our teachers so that they learn more because they want to. They want this to go well, and they really want to educate their students. You know, they'd love to have them full time, but, you know, obviously we can't do that quite yet. So it's 7:51, so I'm going to end it, but I will keep track of the questions that you have. And if you have any questions, please email me. At any time, obviously Dr. Sullivan too, but you know, if you have questions about the curriculum or the assessment and where we're at, please feel free to email me at lscollins@cohassetk12.org. And I'm on the website so you can find me. So Greg, thank you so very much for joining us and giving us a quick overview. We really appreciate it. And I know our teachers loved their work with you too. So thank you so very much. And everybody, thank you for joining us. And again, email me if you have more questions. We don't have enough time. There's not enough time in the day for us to touch everything. But thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for the
Thank you, Greg,
opportunity.
very
Have a
much.
wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you. Dr. Scollins, if you hold on, I'll type some answers to these questions.
Okay.
We'll get them, and then I can cut out. We'll say goodbye to Greg now.
Okay.
Thank you, Greg, very much.
Good evening, everyone. Good luck. Thanks again.
Thank you.